In this video, I'm going to show you how to install cedar shingle wall siding on this outhouse here. This is a kind of siding that I really like. I like the looks of it. I like the fact that it's ecologically sound. It certainly is more trouble and more skill dependent than something like, say, vinyl siding, but if you care about going a more natural route and using a siding material that, in my opinion, is a lot more beautiful than something more modern, then this is certainly worth considering. This is the sort of siding I used not only on this outhouse here, but on our cabin in the woods as well. And I really like it for a few reasons that I'm going to explain. There are some tips and tricks that make this job go faster and give you more visually beautiful results, and I'll be sharing those as well. So let's get started. So I'm here at the back of the outhouse now, and as you can see, this is the section that is not yet complete. So this is where I'll be demonstrating how to install this kind of siding. But before I do, let's go over what you'll need to install cedar shingle siding for yourself. First of all, obviously, you'll need some shingles. These cedar shingles are made by a company called Rustic. Where I'm from in Northern Ontario, Canada, I order these from a fairly far distance away. These are made in New Brunswick, which is quite a number of miles from where I live, but it's worth it to get the kind of quality that this particular brand makes. You could look for local shingle mills in your area, and chances are you'd find one closer than where I found these. But what you want to look for is Eastern white cedar, not Western red cedar. Eastern white cedar is harder and it lasts longer. And you want to get shingles that are fairly thick in their butt thickness. These, I believe, are 3/8 of an inch thick at the butt. You can see if you look closely, these are tapered. All cedar shingles are tapered to a point at the top and wider at the bottom so that they can shed water better. So you want to make sure you get shingles that are 3/8 of an inch thick. Thinner shingles just won't last as long. They're more susceptible to UV damage from the sun and weathering, and they won't be looking nice for as long. Good, thick, Eastern white cedar shingles like these can last up to 70 years or more if they're properly installed, and I've seen them last even longer than that on some local buildings around where I live. Shingles like this come in bundles, usually enough to cover about 25 square feet of wall space at a time. If you make your exposure, the amount of shingle that's visible in each course, 5 inches or so. Now you can play with the exposure and get a specific look to make it shorter or taller, but more on that later. So step one is to find a good source of high quality, thick, Eastern white cedar shingles. One more detail about these too. I paid a little extra for these shingles to get a feature called rebutting and re-squaring. And what that means is that extra trouble and time was taken at the factory where these were made to make sure that all sides and bottom are straight and the corners are exactly 90 degrees. And that just makes it a whole lot easier to install the shingles in a geometrical way, with each layer of shingles being perfectly level without having to do too much modification with the block plane. You'll still have to do some, and again, I'll explain more on that later, but find a good source of Eastern white cedar shingles with a 3/8 inch butt thickness, as close to where you live as you can, and get enough to cover all the wall space you're planning to apply siding to, with some extra, about 10% extra, because things come up and it's easy to under-calculate. So next, let's go over the tools you'll need to install cedar shingles. I like to speed up the work of fastening the shingles to the wall by using an air compressor, a portable air compressor that's around the front side of the outhouse. And this pneumatic air stapler. This is a Hitachi brand stapler, and rather than use traditional hammer and nails, which I do sometimes use, but when I'm doing the bulk of my shingling, I use this. And the fasteners that it shoots are these 1.5 inch long stainless steel staples. These are really good. They hold the shingles more securely than nails do, and because they're stainless steel, you don't have to worry about the fasteners rusting away over the decades and leading to brown staining, which can happen if you use non-stainless steel fasteners. It's true that stainless steel staples like this aren't cheap, but in my opinion, they're totally worth it to have peace of mind that your shingles will never go anywhere for as long as they last on your wall. So this stapler is what I use, but sometimes you get into a corner where you do have to use hammer and nails. So I keep a regular hammer on my belt here, and in one of my belt pockets, I have these stainless steel nails. These are 2-inch long stainless steel nails with fairly large heads that hold the shingles pretty well. And once again, because they're stainless steel, you don't have to worry about rusting and rust staining appearing on the shingles after the fact. Some other tools that come in handy for cedar shingle installation are a portable battery-powered compound miter saw that can change its angle to cut bevels and miters, and a block plane. Sometimes you need to modify the shape of shingles to plane their edge a little bit, and this comes in really handy for that. In fact, it's absolutely essential to have one of these, in my experience. A tube of construction adhesive, because sometimes you get to a point where you can't shoot staples or even hammer nails to secure your shingles, like when you're getting up under the eaves of the roof and there just isn't physically space for that. So that's where gluing shingles into place helps. But sometimes the glue alone isn't enough to hold them until it dries and they start to slide down the wall. So to prevent that, I use this pneumatic pin nailer, a 23 gauge pin nailer. This one's made by Rigid, and it shoots tiny little headless pins. You can see them inside the viewing window there. And those secure shingles along with glue in tight spaces where you can't use the big stapler or you can't swing a hammer. You'll also need at least one level. I have a 4-foot level that I use here to mark lines on the wall for each course or layer of shingles, because you want to make sure that those are perfectly straight and level. And sometimes you need to check the plumbness of your shingles as well, how straight up and down they are. So for that, I use this little 6-inch level that I keep in my tool belt here. So the first step to installing shingles is to figure out what you're going to do with the corners. You can see here that I've milled and installed some vertical cedar boards on the corners to give me something to butt the shingles up against. That's by far the easiest method for how to deal with corners when you're cedar shingling. You can also do what's called woven corners, where there are no boards and the shingles overlap over each other in an alternating pattern on the corners. That's a lot trickier. It looks nice, but it is trickier, and if you're a beginner, you'd be better off to do something like this. Then you want to use your level to start your first course, and obviously you're going to be starting right at the bottom. If you use boards, you're going to be starting level with the bottom of the board. And then you work your way across using shingles of different widths. So if you start with a fairly wide shingle, you want to pick out a narrow one and then maybe a medium one and just switch it up. You'll find that each bundle of shingles has a wide variety of different widths. Like this here is a fairly wide one, and then underneath we've got a medium one, and there's some small ones in here too, about this width. So you don't want to go with any one particular width for too many shingles in a row, because the randomness of the width gives the shingle wall a nicer look, just more visual variety. So you start at the bottom and you work your way up. You want to decide on what your course exposure will be. In this case, I'm going with a 5-inch exposure, so 5 inches of shingle visible on each layer. And as you work your way up, you use your level to draw a level line across the wall for each subsequent course. And I've already done that here. I don't know if you can see it from there, but I have a pencil line here. And that's when you pick your next shingle and you examine the bottom edge of it to make sure that the cup is facing in towards the wall. Most shingles are cupped or bowed in a little bit on one side, and you want that cupped surface to be against the wall so that the shingle doesn't end up cupping out away from the wall as it dries in the sun. You want to make sure that you choose a width of shingle that overlaps the seam of the preceding 2 shingles below it by at least 1 inch or 1.5 inches. That's kind of the key to cedar shingling, overlapping the joints with subsequent layers of shingles so that the wall will shed water properly. You don't want to be picking a width of shingle where the seam lines up with the seam on the previous layer, because then you're vulnerable to water getting in there and causing damage. So in this case, this shingle, which is about 4 inches wide, just so happens to line up perfectly with the line that I've drawn. There's no wonkiness to it, and it overlaps the seam by a good 2 inches. So I'm going to go ahead, take my air stapler and drive a staple, shoot a staple I should say, and then another one on the other side. And that's all there is to it. That shingle is up and I can move on to the next one. Now in this case, this next one, I could either go with a narrow shingle to overlap the seam or a really wide shingle to overlap 2 seams at once. And I'm going to go for the really wide option. The cup is in this direction. I'll line it up with my pencil line here, just like that. And once again, shoot 2 staples. The staples are about 1/2 inch or 3/4 of an inch from the edge of each shingle. You don't want to shoot the staples too close to the middle, or the shingle will start to curl away from the wall over time. And that's basically the pattern. You just keep going like that. Actually, I can show you the next one too, because now we've reached a point where we're encountering the corner board. So in this case, you need a shingle of a very specific width. Now, chances are you're not going to find a shingle of that exact width. So that's where the utility knife comes in. I don't think I mentioned you need a utility knife before when I was going over the tools, so sorry about that, but you need a sharp utility knife, and you place the shingle upside down in the space that it's going to occupy. And you can see here this shingle's too wide. It's overlapping the adjacent shingle. You just make a little mark in the shingle with your knife, and that will show you how narrow that shingle needs to be. And then you cut it. I'll use that mark I made along with another shingle to cut this shingle a little bit narrower. It does take a few passes usually, especially at the bottom where the shingle's thick, but usually pretty easy. And now this shingle should fit nicely in our spot next to the corner boards. So let's see how we did trimming that shingle to width. Yeah, looks like it'll fit pretty snugly. Actually, it won't. It's still a little too big. You can see it's not quite nestling in. So what we need to do, this is not uncommon when you're cutting a shingle to a specific width, we need to use our block plane to plane it down just slightly so that it'll fit. So we'll take the block plane and the shingle and make a few passes, making sure you're planing from top to bottom evenly. There, that should probably do it. Let's see how we're doing. And yes, perfect. That now fits snugly in the spot. And we can take our stapler, our air stapler, and fasten it down. So normally in a typical course of shingles, we would now just continue along the wall following the pencil line I've drawn until the course was complete. But in this case, we're interrupted by the bottom of this window here. So how do we deal with that? Because you're going to run into windows and doors and other obstacles as you shingle a wall. Well, we need to start cutting our shingles shorter so that they butt up against the bottom of the brick mold of this window on the top end and come down to the pencil line I've drawn on the bottom end. The top pencil line was a mistake. It's the bottom pencil line that we're going with. So the first step in this sort of situation is to take a tape measure, measure from the bottom of your window or door opening or trim, and determine what length you need your shingles to be. And in this case, I need them to be 10 3/8 inches. So let's cut a few shingles to 10 3/8 inches and we'll go from there. This is where our portable chop saw comes in handy. 10 3/8 inches. And perfect. 10 3/8 inches is a good fit. Every so often, despite the shingles being rebutted and re-squared to be as geometrical as possible, you still run into a situation like this, where if you look at the pencil line below the shingle, you can see that it's touching, the shingle's touching it on one side and not on the other, despite the fact that it's tight against its neighboring shingle. So in cases like that, we need to take our block plane and purposely plane the shingle so it's a little bit out of square, so that it aligns with the horizontal line at the bottom properly. The idea is to make it narrower at the top than the bottom in this case, so that the bottom of the shingle is where it needs to be. There we go. Now you can see how it's touching the pencil line everywhere, and it's also quite tight to the neighboring shingle. Problem solved. Now that that course of shingles is complete, we'll do a measurement for the next course up, measure 5 inches, make a little mark, and then turn that mark into a horizontal pencil line. You don't want to make the pencil line too dark, just a little light pencil line so it won't be visible later. If you're dealing with a longer wall, like a full-sized building, then it makes sense to swap the pencil and the level for a chalk line, so you don't have to bother continuing the line all the way across in stages with a level. But for a small building like the outhouse, the level and pencil work fine. With our line drawn, we can start shingling the next course. Start with this small shingle, butted tightly up against the edge of our corner board. Line it up with our pencil line and shoot the staples. From there, you just continue across, just like I already showed you, making sure that your shingles are tight together, that the bottom of each shingle is perfectly aligned with your pencil line, and that you overlap the joint between each previous shingle with your current shingle by at least 1 inch or 1.5 inches. And you can hear my air compressor is just kicked on there to make sure this thing keeps shooting. As you drive your staples or nails, it's important to make sure that you drive them high enough up on the shingle so that they won't be visible when the next layer of shingles is installed. So in other words, my exposure is 5 inches, so I have to make sure that I shoot these staples around 6 inches up from the bottom of each layer of shingles to ensure all those staples are covered. Now I'm getting to the point where I'm encountering the bottom of that window again, only this time I'm higher up. Sometimes in situations like this, you have to cut a shingle with a 90-degree notch taken out of it to neatly go around the bottom of the window or door. So the way you do that is you hold up the shingle you're going to use flush with the bottom of the current course of shingles, and you use your utility knife to make a mark flush with the bottom of the window or door. And then you butt it up underneath against the existing shingle, the existing course of shingles, and make a mark on the top flush with the edge of the window or door. And then you just use another shingle to connect the two marks and take that piece of shingle out. So I'll just line up this shingle that I'll use as a cutting guide with my horizontal mark and my vertical mark. Make the horizontal cut. And the vertical one. Want to make sure not to over cut beyond your lines, beyond your marks rather. And a little bit of the wood was left in there, so I'll just clean that up with the knife. Now we'll test out this notched shingle. Perfect. It fits exactly like we need it to. Now we're going to continue along underneath the window with short cut-off shingles 5 inches high to match the exposure here. But before we do that, it's time to introduce the construction adhesive as an alternate method to fasten shingles. In this case, we're able to drive a staple here, but 2 staples side by side here in this higher part of the shingle won't secure it at all over here, and it could be susceptible to curling away from the wall in time. So in this case, we're going to use a combination of 1 staple here and glue and almost invisible pin nails over on the other side. So we'll just bloop a little bit of PL Premium construction adhesive onto this side of the shingle. And for good measure, we might as well do it on the other side as well. Doesn't take a whole lot. And then we'll slide this into place, being careful not to smear the glue. We'll drive 1 staple, as I said. And on the other side, we'll take our 23 gauge pin nailer, this little guy here, and shoot a couple of pins on the top and bottom, just to secure that while the glue dries. So here's our first off-cut piece that will be completely glued and pinned. No staples or nails, because those would be visible with this little off-cut, and we don't want any visible fasteners. I just do a little perimeter bead of construction adhesive and a couple of dabs in the middle to hold it securely over the ears. And then we slide it into place tightly, tight against the bottom of the window brick mold and flush with the line. And then we make sure that it stays there with our pin nailer. 2 pins is usually enough. Got our next one ready to go here. From here, we'll continue along this course, following the line with more short off-cut pieces of shingle until we reach the area that's past the window. And then, of course, we'll switch back to regular shingles. And then you just continue up the wall in the same way you've seen, marking a line for each subsequent course of shingles, moving higher and higher up the wall until you get to the underside of the roof, at which point you'll have to start cutting the tops of shingles at an angle to meet the roof. But that's basically all there is to cedar wall shingling. There are some other fancy features you can add, like round or pointy shingles up near the peak of the roof for style. I'll do another video on how to do those later, but this is what I like to do for siding on buildings on my property, and hopefully you've been inspired to give it a try as well. Thanks very much for watching this video on how to install cedar shingle siding. I hope you found it useful and interesting. If you did, please give the video a like, share it with your friends, and subscribe to the Cabin in the Woods channel for lots more great videos about what we're up to here in the woods.